Anyone who comes to an event hosted by the Canadian Journalism Foundation knows how to read, so I'm not going to recite the bios that you've already read in the programs. But I wanted to say a few words of my own about our three people tonight. Bruce Arthur is the epitome of the new school of sports journalists. His reputation was established as much by his tremendous Twitter following as the work he does on ink and paper. He's smart, funny, and gives us daily insight into a world we observe but don't always understand. Brenda Irving is one of the country's best sports broadcasters, covering what used to be known, and I stress used to be known, as the amateur beat. She has a tremendous responsibility of telling stories about the Olympics, which I believe are the only sports event in this country that actually attracts non-sports fans. And she works for one of the country's most important sports broadcasters, who has invested decades of money and resources into covering non-professional sports, just like they're going to do again this summer with the Pan Am Games. Now, Stephen Brunt and I go way back, coverage of the 1985 Ontario provincial campaign. He said there was a lot of drinking that went on. I don't remember that. He was a beautiful writer then and remains one now. Not only a tremendous writer, but on top of all the other talents he does on all the platforms. And for my money, Stephen has written some of the very best boxing stories in the history of sports journalism. I want to thank the exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, BMO Financial Group. We encourage you to tweet tonight. The hashtag, we put it up, it's hashtag CJF Talk. And for those of you who can't attend in person, we're live streaming the event. And now, please welcome our panel.
Thanks, Scott. And yeah, we had a great time in 1985. It was that's why Peterson won, because he treated the media very well. I'm not normally a moderator. I'm normally a sidekick or a panelist, so you'll have to bear with me tonight as I moderate. I don't think I've ever actually done this before. I've never been the guy in this chair, but I'll do my best. We will take questions. I hope sooner rather than later. I hope you can drive the conversation a little bit. It's an interesting time in our business. It's in the larger business of journalism, obviously, but it's a very interesting time, especially in sports. I've been through I've transitioned from newspapers within the last few years and become a content provider rather than a columnist or whatever I was before. And I've seen a kind of an enormous shift, and I think all three of us have been through that in different ways. So we come from very different perspectives here. Similar perspectives, but very different. We're working for very different people right now. So I'm going to just talk a little bit, and I will try not to read too much, but quickly, and then maybe I'll get you guys to just talk about the universe as you see it right now. From your point of view, both of your points of view, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound like moderating?
Yeah,
is that moderating?
Good to me.
More or less.
All righty. When we found out about this, one of the things I thought about, I had the chance to talk to Bob Lipsyte a little while ago, just before I got the call about this panel, and we had him on the radio. Bob Lipsyte was just then stepping down as the ombudsman for ESPN. And it's a great thing that ESPN has an ombudsman, and he was the ombudsman through some pretty interesting times there himself. But Bob Lipsyte is one of my great heroes in journalism. He was one of the first new sports writers, in the early '60s in the New York Times. He was one of the first guys that did, what Bruce does and a lot of people do now, which is kind of cover sports as a real world thing. Merge the pretend world of sport and the fantasy world of sport with the universe in which we actually live, and deal with issues, and deal with economics, and deal with morals, and deal with labor, and deal with all of those things that become a part of it. Bob Lipsyte's one of the guys who invented that and wrote a book called Sports World, which, if you're interested in this stuff and you haven't read it, you should go find it somewhere in a used bookstore and read it. It's the Bible. So Bob came on the radio, and I immediately went into old newspaper guy mode and talked about the good old days when there was we all kind of understood who we worked for and what our job was, and how there was a China wall between advertising and editorial, even in sports, even in the toy department. There was always that absolute division, and now it's all blurred, and look at the cross ownership, and we don't know who we worked for, and isn't that terrible? And Lipsyte immediately popped up and said, well, actually, that's not true. That's a kind of a false nostalgia for a world that never existed. And he started talking about the sports writers in the early 20th century who were on the take and on the payroll, and about guys later than that whose travel expenses were paid by the teams they covered, and of course almost everybody who spun fairy tales about these great blemish-free heroes in the sporting world who were not that at all. So it's always been a little grayer, than we make it out to be sometimes. And I think it's important to keep that little bit in perspective, and it helped me. As I said, 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago now, 3.5 years ago, I had a conversation with John Stackhouse, the editor of the Globe and Mail, and I was then still at the Globe and Mail. I'd been there for 27 years, and I'd been the sports columnist since 1989, and we were having a discussion. We didn't, it was a discussion. That something had come up which we disagreed about rather vehemently, and it was kind of a tipping point for me, in terms of whether I was going to stay at the newspaper. I'd been doing broadcast stuff on the side for a long time, like a lot of us have, and I'd been in radio and kind of dabbled in it, but it was a tipping point moment. And I remember what I said to John was, you're not really in this business anymore. You're not really in this business. You're not in the sports business anymore. You can't be. You can't compete. You can't compete with the people who have vested interests, with these massive companies that have vested interests, that are rights holders, that in some cases are owners. They have a direct financial stake in this thing, and they have a reason to go out and spend the money to cover it. Whereas, the old sports model, even in the good old days, sports was not a great revenue generator for the newspaper. I see John Hongrig out there. Is that true, John? Yeah. So there was, we had, enough ads to keep the truss. We had enough sports to keep the truss ads apart on the sports pages. We didn't have a lot of the glamorous advertising in sports. We had the odd car ad, but sports cost money. It costs money to cover sports. You have to travel. You have to go places. You have to do things, and there's not a lot of revenue that comes in. But it's in the sense of the great general newspaper, it was one of the things you provided your readership, and of course it was the place you found out. When the newspaper dropped on your doorstep in the morning, you found out who won the game last night. Or if you saw a PM, you got the quotes and you found out what the guys had to say about that game. That's ancient history. And the Globe and Mail wasn't competing with the Star anymore, and it wasn't competing with the National Post, and it wasn't competing with the Sun. It was competing with ESPN and Sports Illustrated and Sportsnet, which is Rogers, and Bell, TSN, even though we were part of that company. All these companies that had a vested economic interest in sports content. And John said, no, you're wrong. We're way smarter than all of them are, and we're going to do all things a very different way, and they'll eat our dust. The Globe, the Super Bowl was, as some of you know, the Super Bowl was played last Sunday. 8 million Canadians, more than 8 million Canadians watched the game. It was the highest television number in the history of the United States, but 8 million Canadians watched that game. And one of those 8 million Canadians was the Globe guy covering it because he watched it in Toronto and wrote it off the TV. That's what's happened. The Globe and Mail has 7 sports writers now. Not all of those are fully committed to sports. When I walked into that department many, many years ago, there were more than 25. So that's the environment I left. That is the huge shift that has happened. It's happening not just here, obviously, but happening in the United States. The gutting of newspaper sports sections. A lot of newspaper people moving into either into broadcast or into online work. Most of it connected to companies that have some kind of vested interest, either as rights holder or as owners or as both. The other current, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit tonight, the other big shift has been that, we used to be the only people that had access to the means of production. If you wanted to communicate about sport or write about sport, you had to work for big media. You had to work for a newspaper, you had to work for a broadcaster, you had to have access. You had to have the pipeline to get that content out to people, and the only way to do it was through a newspaper or through a radio station or through a television station. If you weren't inside, you couldn't do that. And essentially, if you weren't one of those people in the press box, you couldn't do that. There was no other way to be a sports writer. Well, what we've seen, especially in the last 10 years, is the technology becoming available so that anybody has access to the means of production. Anybody can be a publisher, anybody can be a broadcaster, anybody can reach the world, and you don't have to be inside the press box. The view from the stands, or the view in front of the television, the Bill Simmons view of sports, I guess it's not really about validity, but it has been, whether it's equally valid, but it certainly has currency. Bill Simmons may well be the most read sports writer in the world. And Bill Simmons has never had a credential and has never sat in a press box and writes from a fan's point of view and makes no bones about that. You know,
I have actually sat with him in a press box.
so there you go.
I should say, but you're right.
Yeah.
In that the business, I got into the business in 2001, which was right at the peak of newspaper revenues in North America. And if you look at the graph, it's been a water slide since then. I was also laid off 17 days into my first full-time job at the National Post. I came out here for an internship. I got hired full-time. 17 days in, the ASPR said, we're cutting sports and arts. So I got laid off. The next day, the car manufacturers, the car auto guys, they called the advertisers and said, where's the sports section? And so they brought back one page of the sports section. Eventually they brought back more because there was a demographic that was interested in sports. Eventually they started committing to sports again, but the National Post for a long time did what the Globe did for the Super Bowl, is we stayed home. And eventually you traveled more and you traveled more, because the thing is, I still think that to do it right you have to be there most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time. And that does cost money. I just came back from the Super Bowl. And I stayed in a hotel, and I had to take cabs, and I had to eat meals, and that had to be paid for by Mr. Hondrich. And I appreciate that, John. But the business since I've gotten in has changed to the point where people ask me how to get into the sports business now. I don't know how you get in. There's no one way in anymore. It used to be you'd be in J school or you'd be working for the student paper, and that was the way in. And now the landscape is shifting so fast at every end of it that I don't understand it anymore because I'm far enough away from it that I don't know. But what Steve talked about is true, is that in Toronto especially what's happening is the people who broadcast sports are dividing up the universe. One owns the baseball team and half of the hockey team and the basketball team, and the other one owns half the basketball team and the hockey team and would probably like to own more. And they have more money than any newspaper has ever had, ever. And they care because they make money off sports. And so I work for TSN. I do a bunch of work for TSN. I used to do a bunch of work for Sportsnet. Steve made the jump entirely, and what you're seeing is all the way across the spectrum, everyone has a foot in one camp or the other. And I don't know how much it changes everybody else's job. It doesn't change mine a ton, except that there's one day a week or so I can't write because I got to be on radio. But the way the business is changing is that access at the primary point is in general diminishing, especially if you cover a hockey team in Canada. Who breaks news for hockey teams in Canada? It's almost never beat guys anymore. It's almost never newspapers. The guys who break it are the guys who work for TSN or work for Sportsnet. That's just, they have more access, they have more platform, they have more power, and that's where, as sports has started to realize that information is a commodity, that's where the information goes. So this is challenging if you work in a newspaper, and I work in a newspaper, thankfully, that's still quite committed to sports, and that's one reason I'm there, is that we go to every Leafs game, we go to every Raptors game, we cover the sports in this town and elsewhere. But it's harder, and it's harder and harder. We have the worst deadlines among all. If I'm competing with everyone else in the press box at the Super Bowl, which I am, I have worse deadlines than the guys at ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Yahoo, CBS Sportsline, name them up and down the list. New York Times as well, but that's a different deal. I have less daily interaction with these people. There are 4,000 media members there. How do I write something different? That's the challenge now. And everyone in the business is now faced with a much wider pool. Because 10 years ago, if I went to the Super Bowl, I was competing with, as Steve put, the Globe, the Sun, the Star. And now, anyone can read what I write. Anyone can read what everybody else writes. Who's the best? With diminishing access and with a diminishing ability to do your job. And that's the challenge now. Like, that's where we are. And the fact that the telecoms in this town have taken such an interest in covering sports has fundamentally altered where everybody sits at the table. It's fundamentally altered some people's relationships to those teams. When Rogers covers the Blue Jays, it's a fascinating exercise because for some people you have to wonder, where did they get the information? Where did it come from? For others, they play it as straight as you can. I think Steve is on that list. But the whole Toronto media market is kind of a microcosm for the rest of everything else. Is that ESPN's bigger than everything else in the States, and Sportsnet's bigger than everything else here, and TSN's bigger than everything else beyond Sportsnet. And if you're covering sports, You have to fight against all these things and somehow produce something that's worth something. And that's the challenge of where we are now.
We'll get to, and we'll talk about the, covering the, being at Rogers and covering the Blue Jays at some point, because it is interesting. And, no, but it's also about, the conversation around sport. Fire the coach is part of the content, right? That's part of what the churn. So it's, it's not a propaganda exercise. It's more of to keep the conversation going, as long as you're not pulling the pillars down, and that would go for everybody. Now, you were here to represent. I'm moderating now.
No.
You are here, Brenda.
I'm fascinated. I just want to listen to you two.
But you are here representing the public broadcaster. It's been an interesting couple of years. Obviously, the hockey deal and losing hockey rights to Rogers, but also securing the rights to the next 2 Olympic Games. So speak from the CBC perspective.
Well, it has been certainly interesting times because it was the perfect storm. We were going to have major budget cuts, whether or not we retained hockey or not. And so it's been a difficult time, but looking on the bright side, it's an opportunity, because before we had a bit of divided loyalty. We had half the room, the sports department was committed to hockey, and the other half, well, maybe not half, maybe a quarter, was committed to amateur sport. So now, some of the hockey people are working for Sportsnet, and we're able, the ones of us that are left, able to concentrate solely on developing, an amateur or Olympic sports strategy. And so we can have a clear focus on what we need to do and how we can tell the stories of these amateur athletes, which, don't really get told anywhere else anymore. So I think it's important that, with the Pan Am Games and then the next 3 Olympic Games, we're able to do that. But it's finding the money. I used to travel all over the world to cover various sporting events. But now, that just doesn't happen anymore. I think the last big event I went to was the World Cup.
You're Brazil, right?
Yeah. And that was it. And now, because of economic restraints, and I'm sure this is true of the other television stations, we call it off the tube. So we're sitting there calling, for example, the World Championships are coming up in Shanghai. Well, to be fiscally responsible, Scott Russell will go and a camera and a producer, but myself and Kurt Browning will sit there and call it, in Toronto. I mean, that's a reality. Do I think it's as good? Not because I want a trip to Shanghai, but just to feel and to be able to talk to the athletes and relate those stories over the air. Well, you know what it's like. It's difficult to write about a sporting event when you're watching it on television.
The funny thing is the Super Bowl tries its best to countermand that. Because the NFL is really smart. The NFL is incredibly smart. What the NFL does is it kills you with access at the Super Bowl. It gives you more access than you could ever use. It's like the Homer Simpson where the devil keeps feeding him donuts. It honestly is like that. You get 100 quote sheets a day from players on the podiums. You get an enormous amount of access. 3 straight days of access to every member of every team, except for Marshawn Lynch in this case, but that was its own thing. And they will send you not everything that everyone says, but a ton of it, more than you can ever find. And they have press conferences every day, and then they have a media party for you on Tuesday night, and you get a police escort to go see the teams at 7 a.m. on Wednesday and Thursday morning. And they make it really easy, unless you want to write about the real stuff, unless you want to write about their concussion numbers. They have one thing about the concussion numbers. They have one press conference. They have a doctor, they have a doctor, they have a doctor, and they have a vice president who used to be a congressional spin master, and they will tell you the concussions are down to .43 a game, which is garbage. It's complete garbage. But that's their story, and they're sticking to it. And they have graphs, and they have charts, and that's what they'll give you. And if you really want to talk about concussions with players, if you really want to find out what's going on, the Super Bowl is not the place you're going to find out about it. But the NFL still gives you so much. If you are, of the 4,000 journalists there, if you're a lousy journalist, or if you're a boring journalist, or if you're a guy who just wants to write about the football, which is fine, that's okay, you could never leave your room and cover the Super Bowl very comfortably. Like you can get video clips, you can get quotes, you can get everything. You could, in theory, do it here. You could then watch the game. There's post-game action feeds of some of the podiums. You won't get everything. You'll get 75% of it, and you can write some really earnest, boring as hell stories about the Super Bowl. But that's what most of the media is at the Super Bowl. Like most of these, one of the questions they asked this week was, what does the slogan, "Do your job," mean to you? Well, but that's how the NFL does it. The other leagues are a little bit different. They try to kind of put access into small boxes, smaller boxes even than the NFL. And it's the same thing about keeping you away from the real stuff. And to me, the real stuff is kind of, there's wider issues at play in sports. But they don't, like the NHL at the Stanley Cup Final will give you 3 players a day on an off day. Write something interesting out of that. Go for it. It's hard. But sports has realized that information is a commodity and its broadcast rights are a commodity and everything about it is a commodity. Everything about it can be sold. And that's what the whole game is about right now. Like, that's what the NFL is about. That's what everybody's about. Roger Goodell wants the NFL to be a $25 billion league. Now, at this point, the press serves their interests. If the entire press corps all went to the concussion press conference and wrote about the real numbers that are probably happening in the NFL, that might change. But that's a huge thing now, is that I think it's better if you're there. But it costs money to be there. And it becomes a cost-benefit analysis for a lot of places. And the telecoms, they're there. Because, again, they make money off sports. And TSN was carrying the Super Bowl, they sent people. Because that's part of the package. For newspapers, it's very, very different. Post Media now is going to, once they buy the Sun chain, they're going to own all but 4 major papers in this country. Toronto Star, Winnipeg Free Press, Globe and Mail, and Halifax, I think. They're going to own everything. They will send one writer to the Super Bowl. They will send one writer and whoever is from the home city to the Grey Cup. It used to be that the chain would send 10 writers to the Grey Cup. One from every city. You get a columnist from every city would go. A columnist from every city would go to the Super Bowl. That's diminishing. It's diminishing. It's diminishing. Because it makes sense. They run Cam Cole across the whole chain. He's great. Nobody else gets to go. And so for newspapers, we're on smaller and smaller islands. And the Toronto Star is its own island altogether, which is both freeing and it makes it more difficult. So that's a part of where we are.
I'm gonna ask you one more. Can I ask you one more CBC question here, Brenda? And then we can go on from that.
My boss is here, though.
I know, and that's why I'm giving you time to take a deep breath here. When, as one of the kind of barbarians who came over the wall there, the Rogers people, we are in the CBC now for hockey. We're on the 8th floor in the CBC. We have different colored badges so people can spot us in the elevator.
Make sure you're not taking anything out.
Yeah, it's not, and it was a kind of chilly place to arrive at. I got to tell you, it was not.
A little strange.
Wasn't that warm? Yeah. We weren't greeted as conquerors, happy
Well, you
conquerors.
took over our space.
Yeah,
Come on, I had to move.
But in terms of that culture shift there, okay, so yeah, the barbarians do come over the gates, but you're also, it's been a funny, like hockey night was supposed to be, this is where the money comes from, this is what props up everything, the stars of hockey night are our biggest stars, this justifies everything else we do on some level economically, so, we're beholden to this thing, and when that disappears, and other guys, and these other folks show up, what, is, like, I just kind of, what sense, as somebody who is a CBC lifer, what the feeling was watching that happen? Was there any sense of, thank God that's over, we can kind of clear the decks?
In some ways it was, again, I was working primarily for the amateur sport, or the Olympic sports side. So you don't think we were a little envious of the guys that were on the other side of the room who got all the attention and obviously all the money because they made all the money? And so in some ways, I mean, the silver lining, the fact that CBC lost hockey was that now our voice can be heard. Now everyone has to rally around what we want to do. So, that was a nice feeling. But I remember I went up to the hockey night set on the 10th floor and looked around. Wow. Whoa. Because it's a beautiful multi-million-dollar set. And yeah, you felt a little bit of sadness that hockey had moved on. But I mean, I'm sure Jeffrey Orridge, who's in the room, could speak to this, but I'm sure that even if we would have retained hockey in some way, the amount of revenue CBC would have got would be minuscule.
I'd love to have Jeffrey speak to this, but I'm not going to. As moderator, I have power here. I know I can do that, but I won't do that.
Maybe he'll get up his feet. But anyway, so I mean, the die was cast, that,
Yeah.
that this is how things would move forward regardless, and that CBC would be without that source of income, no matter whether Rogers, or TSN Bell got it.
It was going to be one or the
we
other,
did.
right?
Yeah.
But this isn't entirely new, right? Like the Grey Cup used to be a CBC property for years and years and years, and the CFL was too, and eventually it went to TSN because TSN wanted to make that one of their properties. And this is the creep. This is how Bell and Rogers have so much money. Like CBC was never really at the table if you were talking about $5.2 billion over 12 years, which is what they were talking about. That's an enormous amount of money. I'll be shocked if Rogers makes money off that deal. Good for them if they do, but that's going to be really hard. CBC didn't have that money. The public broadcaster couldn't have done that. And that's where sports, everything gets colonized by money, and sports is one of those places now. Like, when I was a kid, I remember like someone making $1 million a year in sports. Magic Johnson making $1 million a year was amazing. That's over, right? Like that's nothing. They'll pay that to a guy who cannot skate. But the money is getting bigger and bigger because take a look at how movies are now aimed towards a global perspective, right? I'm old enough to remember when every second movie in a theater wasn't a superhero movie. They do that because you can market it globally because it's simple. It's a superhero movie. Sports is a superhero movie. You can sell sports anywhere. I watched the last Super Bowl in Russia. I was in Sochi waiting for the Olympics, another global television show, and there were 4 guys in the booth, and they were speaking Russian about the Super Bowl. They didn't have ads. They had like ads, 1 of every 4 commercial breaks were ads. So they'd talk for 3 minutes about the Super Bowl. They had a sideline reporter talking in Russian about the Super Bowl. I don't know how many Russians watched it, but it's there. It's everywhere. It's export, right? This is something you can easily transmit anywhere in the world. And so the people who have figured out that this is huge money, ESPN makes up for something like half of Disney's share price. ESPN is a giant. We don't have an ESPN yet, but Sportsnet's probably the closest thing. And Sportsnet is probably only going to keep getting bigger if the commitment stays there.
But you have to look at that, and this is just and this will go down a slightly different path here. But to talk about the Rogers hockey deal, to talk about it in terms of as a conventional television rights deal is a mistake because it's not. And it's we are that kind of that version of television. Essentially as an advertising platform to pay for something that you pay an enormous amount of money for is we're past that now, and that deal has as much to do with keeping people from cutting their cables and phones, which are 80%. Those 2 things make up 80% of what Rogers is, as it has to do with advertising sales on television and ratings in a kind of in the old school sense. That deal will be measured by where television is 3 years from now, 5 years from now, never mind. And I have no idea how we will be processing that content 12 years from now. I can tell you won't be a family gathered around a big box television set watching commercials. So that's a new model, we're talking about. And the value in that deal to a company like Rogers it's not a conventional rights holders arrangement. It's about affinity, it's about exclusivity, it's about having content. And again, the reason sports is a growth industry, sports media is a growth industry, thank God it is, is that you have to watch it live. People won't PVR sports and watch it after the fact like they'll do with everything else. They do have to watch it live. So you own those eyeballs for a certain amount of time, and you can get at them in a lot of different ways, in a way that you can't if somebody is watching conventional television and PVRing it, watching it when they want, or watching an entire series in an evening. If you're going to watch the Super Bowl, you're going to watch the Super Bowl on Super Bowl Sunday as it happens. So that's where the value is. It's not just the numbers, but it's how you have those numbers, the control you have over those people, the loyalties that you have, that people will tune in week after week, game after game. They're not judging each game by the quality of it. It's not like a movie. It's not like it's going to get canceled. You watch the Leafs because you watch the Leafs and you're loyal. You have incredible brand loyalty, and that's what Rogers paid for. And that's what Bell would have paid for. Mm-hmm. They probably would have paid more for it. There was like if you ask Michael Cope or George Cope would tell you they would have paid more for it. Yep.
But the way people consume it now too is you just don't watch the TV. I mean, it's half the audience probably has, another computer going, and they're live chatting about the event, and then you're reading the tweets and what people are saying. So they're getting all this it's citizen journalism where you're getting all this reaction and thoughts from everyone else. So when you go to cover an event, or I do, like what then are we expecting the reporters to bring that maybe they're not getting from those other sources?
It's a great question, Brett, because the first adjustment that we had to make was the realization that everybody had seen the game that we were writing about. Mm-hmm. Because there was a point when that wasn't true, that all games and everything weren't on television necessarily, and certainly, so we were the first source of information for people sometimes, or a primary source of information just about what happened, who did what when, who scored, how did it happen.
This is why game stories used to be terrible.
Yeah,
because that's what they were.
That's right.
That's all they were. So this happened, then this happened, then this happened.
So the first shift is, okay, we now understand that every game is available to everybody at any time. If anybody cares about the game, they watch the game. So then what's your role? Is your role commentary on that game? Is it expertise? Are you bringing some kind of analysis to it? Well, and then that stuff became instant as well. Mm-hmm. The idea that, and there were people analyzing games who probably knew more than you did. And the commentary was instantaneous. The commentary on the terrible call in the Super Bowl was instantaneous. That conversation didn't start the next morning when a newspaper arrived, and it didn't start when there was a sportscast in the evening. It started as it was happening.
Right.
Through all of so how do you, if you're telling that story or if you're commenting on that story, then where are you and how do you place yourself?
But that's where you have to be, like if you're at the event, that's something that you can give the atmosphere, whether it's at the World Cup. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to tell you anything about a particular game that probably the guys back in Toronto who aren't there, are going to tell you, but I can tell you what the atmosphere is like and the people that I've met and take the viewer along the journey with you, and maybe it isn't even that sports-centric. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just about what's happening around the stadium and the fans and things like that. But it's amazing how instantaneous the feedback is on Twitter to whatever I have done. If it was in Brazil, for example, just thoughts, positive, negative. I had one person fact check something for me, and they were right. Mm-hmm. I was wrong, but it's pretty interesting to get that immediate feedback, and you can tell from that what people want and what they don't want.
How much has the conversation become the content, though? Because and this is not a huge part of what sport is not just the empty spectacle of sport and being watching people do amazing things or not do amazing things. In the case of the Leafs. It's always been the conversation, right? It's a bunch of people sitting around saying, "Did you see that?" Or
sitting in a bar,
fire
sitting
the
around
coach.
your TV, all that.
So this is that writ very large, but it has become. Again, Bruce, and you're very much, you're a social media guy.
What a sad statement.
And I'm a conscientious objector, but I think that when we talk about the blogosphere, I think it's that has become that the conversation around sport has become a lot of the content. That and kind of. Expert stuff,
well, there's
insider stuff.
There's two different things. There's the blogosphere, which is anyone can sit and give their impression of the game, and there's advantages and disadvantages to that. And like you take a look at what Deadspin does, they're on a totally different track than what other people are doing because they're free, right? I was talking to one of the best sports columnists, probably the best sports columnist in North America, not long ago, and he said, "I'd love to work for TMZ because they can pay for information." Like there's a whole different track that's going to happen. Twitter is a different thing. Sports is. And especially in the big events, the only other thing that kind of works like this is award shows. It's the campfire around which we're all gathered, right? Like it's the thing that pulls more people in to watch at the same time than anything else. We used to all watch things together, right? The MASH season finales numbers, they had like 90% of America watch the MASH season finale. That cannot happen anymore. Like the world could be ending. 90% of America would not watch it on CNN. They'd have something else to do. But sports pulls more people in than anything else. And what happens with Twitter now is it's similar to how in the press box where I look and there's 100 national columnists and I'm trying to beat all of them. On Twitter, it's bigger. Everybody gets to comment on it. And it's a meritocracy in terms of on Twitter you choose which conversations do I want to listen to. And I find it's actually better for my job to be on Twitter. Steve would disagree, at least for his job. But that's where the conversation is happening, where the first wave conversation is happening, the immediate conversation. That's the bar. And that's where everyone's watching television. And you run through the thoughts on things so quickly that it's like when that call happened in the Super Bowl, when they throw the ball at the 1 yard line, terrible play. Everyone in the world can offer their opinion on it. Who can offer the smartest opinion? Well, we'll find out. And then it's the same thing when you're writing your column afterwards. Who's going to write the smartest column about it? Who's going to write the best column about it? And that's the second wave challenge. Because you cannot match what happens on Twitter in a column. You can't match it. You in a blog, you can take all the tweets, put them together. But you cannot, that's its own animal. And Twitter to me is the first thing that I've seen that makes me go, okay, the internet and TV are eventually going to be the same thing. I don't know how it's going to look. But they're going to be the same thing because it's an interactive experience. When I watch sports, I almost never watch sports without Twitter open because it adds to my experience of the sport. Like I'll watch intently, but I can bounce back and forth. It's an instinct for me now. And it sharpens my opinions on things and it'll pick up things that I don't notice. And I'm competing with everyone else who's doing that too. And so there's a democratization of analysis of sports. But it's the same in Twitter as it is with columns. Who's the best at it? For what you want. Who's the funniest? Who's the smartest? Who's the best analyst? Who combines those things the best? That's all this is. Now, you can democratize Twitter all you want, but those people aren't getting paid. I've never made money off Twitter. But it's made me better at my job. What I write in the second wave is better because of Twitter. Partly because I get to test drive lines from the column in real time. Dave Perkins from the Toronto Star used to do this. He used to walk up down press row and give you a one-liner. And if you laughed, maybe he'd put it in the column. And that's how he was Twitter before Twitter. Yeah. Now I don't have to get up. I can just do this. And if it's a line that I like, it's my immediate impression. It's almost like I'm taking notes. But this is all changing so fast. When I was at a student newspaper, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, none of this stuff existed. Vine is transforming watching sports. 6-second clips. NBA Vine is amazing. It's incredible. I can open up my phone. I don't really pay attention to Vine. I'll take a Vine once in a while, something I'm watching on TV. I'll post it. I won't really look at it again. I'll look at it again, and 1.6 million people have looped it. Because it's like chopping up highlights in real time. By the time Left Shark had finished dancing at the Super Bowl, in the Katy Perry halftime show, it was content for 1 million places. It had already been chopped up and disseminated and packaged and sent to users. This is sports now. If you go to a sporting event, there's a great chance that if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're going to become a meme. You could be an idiot or a hero or whatever it is. The Boston bullpen cop who does this as the outfielder's legs are doing this next to him. And that becomes a thing for like days. And then we burn through it and we go to the next thing. And we're racing. But sports is just big. It's bigger than it's ever been. And it's going to get bigger than that. And it's going to get bigger than that. And none of us know where the consequences are going to be, but you can guess. We're going to get less access to athletes because they're worth too much money. And we ask inconvenient questions. TV is going to become bigger rather than smaller. And eventually what you'll see, my guess, is that instead of the telecoms, it'll be Google who has the NFL contract. Because Google has more money than anybody. Or Apple. And they will use that to enhance their brand. But sports is gold, content-wise. It is the gold standard for everything. And everything that we do is in the context of that. Is that this is, for a lot of people, the most important thing they're going to do that day.
But I'm concerned, the concern for me is just the fact that, the NFL, whether it be the NHL, so you pay billions of dollars for the rights to something. They're becoming more and more controlling about how that information, their message, is getting out.
Well, they try to, except that the message comes out in a million different ways, doesn't it? Right? That they can't.
Does it?
Yeah,
eventually? Look at the NFL, just how controlling they are over their broadcast partners.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of leagues look to the NFL model, and that's the way it's going to be more and more in the NHL, is to control that message, that narrative.
The message and the message. That's an interesting question, because obviously the NFL has took a beating the last 2 years from people who were not their rights holders, and in some cases from people who were their rights holders. Mm-hmm. But there's an interesting line between. I alluded to it earlier that the conversation around sports, some of which is going to be critical, of teams and leagues and
But they don't care
health and
about that.
Well,
The big issues.
well, okay, but so the question is when you actually get to that point, when's it a big issue?
Concussions.
Yeah, I guess, that maybe, although, yeah, that probably would be, that might be something that they would feel vulnerable about, and they would expect, their partners to not attack them on that front, maybe.
Labor's another one on that.
Yeah, although.
In the last NHL lockout, you could see who was in the pocket, not in the pocket, but who was aligned with whom.
Yeah, but we're never going to have another strike in sports. We'll have some more lockouts. We won't ever, and the unions have effectively been neutered in sports.
Yeah.
So I think that's almost over, that narrative, just because I don't see that they'll ever have the leverage to strike again. They'll never be put in a position to strike. So
No, but you'll still get labor stoppages.
maybe.
The NBA's is coming in 3 years.
Yeah, but it'll last.
Yeah.
It'll last a short time and be very spectacular. But but it is an interesting. Again, people there's a sense that there's this massive amount of control exerted over the conversation around sport by the rights holders or by the broadcast partners, and they won't let things be. They want things to be talked about. They want I don't think they want their core business attacked, and it would be understandable that they don't want it attacked by their business partners. But everything right up until that point, I think, is part of the product. It really is.
Well, and you saw that at the Super Bowl. Marshawn Lynch was great copy, right? Like everyone had an opinion about Marshawn Lynch not talking to the media. Mine was, okay. But that became a huge topic in the week. And Deflategate, whether they're deflating the footballs, became an enormous topic. It was it led the CBS Evening News. Now, is that a fundamental attack on the NFL and the way they do business and what the business is? No, it's not. No. I mean, they'll talk about competitive integrity, and that is an important thing because you want to know that what you're watching is as real as it can be. I honestly can imagine a future in which we're all a lot more cynical about this thing, and you will see the actual performance-enhancing drugs next to the statistics that the athlete is on. I could see that happening. Because what we've seen in the NFL is you can keep your eye on the ball, but it's hard work. It's hard work to write about the NFL concussion settlement, which is a monstrous document. A horrendous thing. It cuts CTE, which is the dominant neurological trauma that the NFL kind of generates, out of the settlement. You don't get paid if you die from CTE starting now, right? It's an incredible betrayal of their employees, and the people who write about it, it's like a dozen.
But it's like a science experiment. You just had the NFL go through the worst year in its history in that sense, and pulled the biggest rating in the history of the Super Bowl.
Yep.
So, that's probably tells you more about how people need the content and need the distraction and need whatever sports provides, the collective experience. And you're probably not going to sway them morally or ethically away from that because of the power of that collective experience. You can go on and decide why. What great gap in our lives or our culture that's filling, but it's. Again, it was almost like you couldn't have thrown more at the National Football League this year that would have turned people off, and yet the game triumphed.
Never say never.
Well,
there's always next year. But the people who run sports are not moral people, and I'd say that with no disrespect to them. It's not part of the job. The people who run the IOC are the people who run the IOC. They're not good people. People who run FIFA don't even bother to pretend to not be corrupt. Roger Goodell said, I'm available to the media every day on the Friday of the Super Bowl, and on the Sunday blew off an interview request from NBC who was covering the game. Because the game, after that game, no one was going to remember. Because the sport is so powerful, right? You can hate everything about how the IOC does business, and there's a lot of things that you should hate. But the power of the Olympics is awesome. Going to the Olympics is awesome. Christy Blatchford cries every day of an Olympics. Because it's just so powerful. And I walked out of that football stadium, and I write about concussions, and I write about the way the NFL abuses its employees at all different levels. And I walked out of that stadium on Sunday and said, I'm so lucky I got to see that. Because it was amazing. But this is what it is that's what I try to write in sports on a very wide field, and I try to keep my eye on the ball. And what that means to me is that there's more than just the easy stuff here. And the trick with that is if I worked full-time for a broadcaster which owned the teams or had an NFL broadcasting deal or an NFL team, would I be allowed to write that? I don't know. The ESPN has such a gigantic operation that they have so many churches, anyone can write anything they want. But we don't have that in Canada.
And one thing I find is just going to whatever media, sports outlet it is, whatever property they have. It's interesting to see the lineup between, let's say, what CBC is promoting that day in sports, what TSN is, and what Sportsnet is. It depends whose property it is. The Jays would lead in the summer, right, on Sportnet over, let's say, the CFL would lead on TSN, and then we probably have something about an amateur sport athlete if we could, right? So we're promoting our own properties.
To a point, although that's going to be...
So it's free advertising, and
But there's a way to do it, right?
Well-
There's a thumb on the scale or a foot. And if you do it really well, it's a thumb on the scale, or maybe a hand. We're not quite to the stage where it's a foot most of the time. We may get there.
Okay, I'm going to, because I'm just looking at the time here, we're going to go a little early to questions here. There's a lot of grist for the mill there, but I think there are questions. You get.
I wanted to go down to usurped traveling today, and that's to look at something that's happened this week. The BBC has lost the rights to golf, and they offered 10 million euros, and they lost it by 15 million euros. So the BBC is now left with a threadbare cover. They've almost got no sports that are offering, and people are very, like, there's tons of stuff on Twitter about where this is going and where you're actually going to be able to see sports in England. You have picture comments on what's happened with golf over there, and cricket, and Formula One, and all the other sports.
It's a different broadcast environment, though, too, right? Because because a lot of that, the difference between free and pay there, a lot of that's going to some form of pay, right?
And most of it's going to pay. People are really worried that cricket, a sport like cricket, that's very big, is now marginalized, because people don't want to pay attention.
Yeah.
But that's the test, right? And you get that a little bit with the Rogers deal, is that I talk to friends in Vancouver and they say, if I want to watch more hockey than ever before, I have to pay more than ever before. Well, that's where we're at. How much is it worth to you? How much is anything worth to you? How much is it worth to you to watch a Leafs game? If there are people that get into the building, they will charge that money. And I mean, it sounds like in England they're gonna see how many people are gonna pay that money. But they've got the product.
But you can't have to have a public broadcaster going head to head. I'm not sure what the alternative to that is in terms of rights. Should the BBC be trying to outbid, Sky for those rights? I don't know if it went to Sky. I'm not sure where the golf rights went, but yeah.
But that's the market, right? Because the other guys have more money.
Yes.
And that's what it is here, is the other guys have more money.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how you do that, like how you change that. I guess people will, again, I guess people will adjust, and the market doesn't solve everything, believe me, but I'm not sure what the alternative is for a public broadcaster. I don't know that you can go head to head with, again, these companies that have such a huge vested interest in the content in a way that a public broadcaster can't. They're going to be operating on a pretty conventional model, right? BBC. It's going to be an advertising-based model. Can they compete with? You're going to compete with Rupert Murdoch, head to head when Murdoch, has a whole other set of interests. I'm not sure. We went through this a lot when we talked about the Grey Cup leaving CBC. The Grey Cup is beyond an institution beyond sport in this country, and did it rightfully belong on the public broadcaster? Well, maybe it did, but how do you make that happen? I'm not sure that there's a regulatory way you can make that happen. And if the market dictates, it's never going to happen. Those things aren't ever going back.
not at all.
Questions, and if you ask a question, could you go to I've been asked you to go to the mic in the middle of the aisle so that the people who are hearing this streamed can hear us. Are there any other
There's
questions?
a stream?
Are we
Hello,
streaming?
stream.
We are being streamed, aren't we?
Give me your Twitter handle.
Surely someone would like to attack Rogers.
Oh,
That's true. I've been waiting for that.
well, better Rogers and CBC.
No, you guys are, you're the victims
We're golden now?
Yeah.
I like that role.
Hi, I'm happy to ask a question. I'm wondering whether or not, considering that about 45% of the people who watched the Super Bowl over the weekend were women, I'm wondering if there's a increasing thought given by broadcasters and others to the changing demographics of their audiences.
Not yet. I mean, take a look at the ads you get in the Super Bowl, right? Like, take a look at how the NFL, it came out today that the nonprofit that the NFL is working with on domestic violence is a sham front dedicated to raising awareness and awareness only that is funded by several major corporations. Fabulous. Like, that's what they think of you. That's what they think of women. Like that's, that's what it is. Like, and it's not in any way a good thing. And I think the first league to figure out who's watching and figure out that they can cater to people beyond gender is going to make a killing. But nobody's figured that out, and no one's willing to make that leap yet.
I mean, amateur sport appeals to women. I mean, and the numbers prove that. I mean, I'm not just talking about figure skating, or tennis. Yes, for some reason, women are more apt to turn on the television when it's Olympic sport or amateur sport. But more and more, I mean, when I was growing up, I was the only, should I say, early 70s and late 60s. I would collect hockey cards and do that sort of thing. There weren't many women then that were interested in sport in that same way. But now, I think just because there's so much access to sport, younger women are much more interested in the big leagues, the professional leagues, NHL, NFL, et cetera, that there weren't in my day, because now it's accessible to them on a television or on a computer.
There are some things that still skew very male. Sports radio, sports talk radio skews almost exclusively male. And they sell. That's what they sell. Males, men 25 to 54. So that's the demographic. It's like Rush. It's all male. The audience is all male. But something like baseball, for instance, has a different demographic mix. And it does skew not quite 50-50, but closer to that in terms of men and women. What they'll do is they'll exploit that, and they'll sell that audience. That's something they'll sell to. But so much of the advertising targeted at sports is so specific. It's about getting to the hardcore male sports audience. You're targeting your advertising. You're trying to get to those people. If you can sell beyond that, they will. But it's still, that's still heavily how they sell sports and how sports is sold to advertisers.
Press box is almost exclusively male, not entirely. People who run sports are almost entirely male. There's one female assistant coach in the NBA, and there is one female analyst on television of a sport that I can think of any major sport, and that's Doris Burke in the NBA.
The one thing I would say, and just to follow up on some stuff Bruce has been talking about the evil NFL, and they're all those things. But I would argue that there's no evidence in history that people make their entertainment choices morally. That's a moral decision what you watch on Saturday night. I don't think there is. I don't think people sit back and make moral decisions about movies and who's making them, or musicians and how they live their lives, or artists and how they live their lives. It's just not. Maybe better universe if that was the truth, but I think there's all kinds of evidence that people check that part of them that at the door, and let the circus go on.
Most of us don't want to know. Yeah.
Ray Rice is now the villain, so it's something to cheer or to not want to win the.
As I said,
the game.
this was like an experiment this year. How many things can we do and still keep the same audience or grow our audience? So let's keep throwing stuff at them.
Yeah.
Let's keep throwing things and see what happens. And it didn't happen, right? And that's the people running sport and the people in broadcasting, everybody understands that. That's folks aren't going to sit back. It takes a lot. Boxing was a big deal in the 1960s. Scott, you know that. There were two guys beaten to death on network television in prime time in the 1960s, and that didn't kill boxing. Now boxing's dead now for a whole bunch of other reasons. But if people watching Benny Kid Paret get beaten to death on national television didn't kill boxing, that tells you that it takes a lot to turn people off those diversions. So we can rail on about how insensitive the NFL is and how immoral they are and what a boob Roger Goodell is, but you know what? It doesn't matter in terms of their core business. It doesn't matter at all. Sorry, it sounds that cynical, but it's true.
And that's the problem, is it is true, which makes my job both satisfying and completely irrelevant.
Yeah, no, it's easy. It's easy to shoot them. Yes, sir.
Quick question. With the pressure to write something interesting, do you think there's also more pressure to compromise journalistic standards to make something more interesting, to create something that is valuable?
The hot take. Hot takes are great. I have never written one, and I hope I never do. It's a lot easier to generate cheap heat than it is to do anything else. It's so easy. It's so easy to write about stuff where you don't really know what you're talking about, and you try to inflame people. And that's always been a part of sports journalism, and it always will, and there are people in this city who do it, and every other city too. It's not really my lane. It's not really what I'm interested in. But I understand why it's appealing to people, because it's empty calories, right? Like, it's something to get angry about, something to enjoy. But if I ever do that, I'm not gonna feel very good about my job at the end of the day.
But I don't know if that's, again, journalistically, that's, if we're talking about something that doesn't, in some of these cases, fundamentally doesn't matter, right? Like, it really doesn't matter if you take an unfair run at a head coach or something. It's fantasy, right? There's no real world consequences to that. So I'm not sure, how to measure that in terms of journalistic integrity. Part of this is.
I don't think it's that hard.
But part of this is entertainment, right? Part of this is about entertainment.
But that comes down to an argument as to whether anything really matters. My friend Ray Ratto in San Francisco says, anything's a guilty pleasure if you think enough about it. Right? Like your phone, or your car, or your house, anything. It doesn't mean you shouldn't note that there's something there. There are real consequences. There's a right and wrong way to do things.
Yeah, but there's no consequence of the Leafs losing 10 games in a row. That's not a real world consequence. It's just churn.
Well, someone's going to get fired, but yes.
Yeah, it's just churn, right? So there is part of this is pretend. It does cross into the real world occasionally, and there are things that have, and I've always thought that you have to bring a different standard to bear when you're dealing with real people and real lives rather than the fantasy lives of the people we're dealing with. Marshawn Lynch not talking to the media, that there's no consequence to that. It's just that's a goof. Unless it was performance art, it was a goof, right? And I just don't think that. I don't think that there's again, I'm a news guy. I came from news. And I understand the weight of covering a court case, or the weight of covering the legislature, or a crime story, or things that actually had. Most of this is pretend. 80% of it's pretend.
What about the rush to get things out on Twitter? Just checking sources and from some of your colleagues. Like, do you think the rush to be first to get it out on Twitter is?
Except that it gets debunked so fast on Twitter, right? Like, it used to be you could report something wrong and it would take a day to correct it. And now it can take 5 minutes, right? Like, so the meritocracy does extend to stuff that's right and wrong on Twitter. I don't know, I'm not a breaking news guy. I mean, I've broken some news, but it's not really what I do. For those guys who do it, your reliability is kind of what you trade in. Like, I know all the guys who are deemed insiders. There's a huge pressure on them not to screw up, because when you do, people remember, and then they won't trust you the next time. And I think it's the same for a columnist. I know what you mean, Steve, and I know what you mean that a lot of this is not real world consequences. We are not covering wars or politics, but I still think you can apply the same craft to it.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying the fact is we don't deconstruct this all the time. Because if we did deconstruct it, we would say it was ridiculous.
Yes.
Right? We would say that, go on, lead your lives, do something else. This actually doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
And that would be bad, right, for us. And it would be bad. And that's not what people want. They don't want to, it's like going to the movies and saying, look, this is not real. People don't want that. They want to indulge in the fantasy. And we're part of it. It's like, again, you can tear it down. You can tear down this, you can expose it as the capitalist sham that it is every day. But, I'm not sure anybody wants to read that. And I think there's a lot of things that we do which are not about, there are moments when, the shining light the light has to shine and the truth has to be told. But if you can spend a lot of time, sports pages is an archaic term, but you spend a lot of time in the sports pages and not hit a lot of that, just in the day-to-day, just because that's really not what we do. It's the old.
And then he said, good.